So let's get going. Let's start with the exploring how the notion of leadership, what we expect of leadership, has changed dramatically throughout the years. So I'm not going to take us all the way back to the beginning of time, but let's go back to the 60s and early 70s and look at what was expected in the leadership space. So early on, management, we weren't really even talking about leadership, right? We were talking mostly about management. And usually you had a pretty homogeneous group of people, and oftentimes the manager was promoted from within the work group. And the expectations were pretty simple. You were supposed to be able to communicate expectations well, like tell these direct reports what you expect of them. You were supposed to let them know how they did relative to these very clear expectations. And you had a little bit of individual contributor responsibilities, but not a lot. Most of what you were doing was managing often sort of these 6 to 10 direct reports. As time went on, as we moved into the middle of the 70s, there started to be a more robust development culture. And so we went from not just communication and feedback, but there was this idea that you were supposed to help these direct reports become more effective, build the managerial pipeline. This is the beginning in the 70s where we started to hear this phrase, do more with less. So you had to cap your head count. You weren't going to get any more money in your budget, but your goals were increasing. So the idea was do more with less. Change was starting to become a more regular idea in the workplace. And so as a leader, you were expected to manage change, both the mechanics of change and the human reaction to change. As a result of that, both do more with less and manage change, now we started to see innovation come into the leadership landscape. You were supposed to be an innovative leader, thinking of different ways to do more with less. During this time, the expectation for what work groups were going to produce increased. And so the goals started ratcheting up, right? So do more with less became higher and higher in terms of goal expectations. This is also the time, although it's taken a while for this to actually take hold, but there was some sensitivity training. And basically what it meant, particularly when it started, was we weren't going to tolerate screaming at direct reports as frequently as we allowed it before. As we moved into the 80s and into the 90s, things became more complex. Technology started influencing more the way we were doing work. Businesses got more complex. More people were entering into the marketplace, making the competitive landscape more complex. And so leaders were expected to be effective at handling complexity. We were flattening out organizations during this time, right? Diminishing the hierarchy. So we moved more individual contributor responsibilities over to the leadership roles. So now people were about half-time individual contributors and half-time leaders. Enter in the concept of executive presence, right? How this really came into being when we were starting to talk really boldly about what's the difference between management and leadership. And this idea of this amorphous idea, by the way, still in 2020, there isn't agreement on what this means, but this idea of executive presence to really show yourself as a leader. Coaching, as we moved into the 90s, became more and more a means of developing people. And as organizations understood how helpful it was, but also how expensive it was, we now expected leaders to begin to become effective coaches. Diversity and inclusion became a much more important element of thinking about organizations and therefore thinking about leadership as we went into the late 90s. As we went into the 2000s, we grabbed this VUCA idea from the military: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This was the shift from managing change as an event to it's always going to happen, so you need to be effective as a leader. And so that brought on the idea of agile leadership. You never know what's going to happen. You have to be quick on your feet. You have to be able to turn on a dime. And then we talked more about global leadership, right? Competitors are global, our customers are global, our vendors are global. It's a global mindset. And so we need leaders. By the way, we never really defined this very well, but we need leaders who have a global mindset. Employee engagement has now become ubiquitous. Every leader is now expected to build employee engagement. So when employee engagement came on the scene, it was more an HR kind of expectation that HR would measure and HR would put programs in. But as it became more commonly used and individual leaders got their scores, there was the expectation that individual leaders would become effective at building employee engagement. Mindfulness came on the scene around 2010. There were a number of organizations in Silicon Valley who were making great claims about how mindfulness was helping productivity and helping teamwork. And so it's made its way into the organizational space of leaders need to be mindful, and leaders need to, in some cases, teach or encourage mindfulness in others. Of course, setbacks are happening. We are winning and losing at different rates. Change is happening very quickly. And so we need leaders who can bounce back quickly and be resilient. And as technology became just, handheld, desktop, laptop, all these different technologies came in, we coined this phrase, we mean the broader we, digital leadership. You needed to be effective digital leader. Of course, nobody has a real definition for that, but that's the expectation, and we see it showing up on competency models. So here we are in a global pandemic. And now a high percentage of leaders and their teams are working remotely. So where remote leadership was more incidental across the leadership population, it has become much more central. The idea that both leaders need to balance home and family with work, leaders need to help navigate that within their teams. So here we are in this space. And of course, I'm sure many of you are thinking that there are things not on this list. That is true. There are more things that, depending upon the industry you're in, the role that you're in, the country that you're in, the specific context that you're in, there is even more on the list, right? So this is where we are in that leadership space. And so as you map the growing expectations for leaders, and I think we would be naive to think we're capping the list where we are now, right? As the world becomes more complex, as the workplace becomes more complex, as we understand the dynamics of human beings more, particularly with the insights we're getting from neuroscience, we are just going to continue to have growing expectations around leadership.